All right. All right, Jay. So thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it. We met through a little bit of a networking group with you in London, right? And me in the States. And I was interested to tell your story. So maybe what we can do is get into, kind of where you grew up in England, I assume, and what your background is and your training. I believe you were in the military as well. And then we can talk about My True North and all the interesting entrepreneurial stuff that you've been involved with, some of the business studies and why people succeed and don't succeed and all that type of stuff. Does that make sense?
Sounds perfect.
All right. So where'd you grow up? Tell me about your background and your training and stuff like that.
I'm really fortunate that I'm not going to be one of those people that say I was born in a cardboard box under a bridge somewhere and had to fight for every meal that I had.
Right.
I was very fortunate enough to have been born into quite an affluent lifestyle. Both my parents were very professional in their work and were very successful, certainly marginally successful prior to me being born. And with that came a whole host of opportunity and privilege, I guess. I was predominantly brought up in my early years by a full-time nanny. I've got 3 younger siblings. Money was never an issue at home. It was more to do with, well, what did you want? Well, let's make that available to you. So I was, in that sense, I was very fortunate. However, it also came with a different set of difficulties. I was told on my 5th birthday as to which school I was going to, which teachers had been chosen for me, which subjects I was going to learn.
Right.
On my 7th birthday, I was advised that when I grew up, I was going to be a doctor.
Right.
That the family needs a doctor in the house, and you could be it.
Right.
And which musical instrument I was going to play, which sports I was going to take part in.
Right.
My whole of my life seems to have been plotted out before me by people that claims to have had a better understanding of what for me to do.
Right, all decided for you, right?
All decided for me, down to which time I sleep and which shoes I was going to wear.
Yeah.
And by the time I was probably 9 or 10, I'd started to run away from home. Not necessarily too far. I always went to the same place, to my paternal grandmother, who was a couple of miles down the road, but didn't live in the same circumstances that I'd been born into. And every time I ran away, my parents would leave me for a day or so and let me calm down and then pick me up and bring me home. And the more frequently I did it, the more reticent they were to keep coming to bring me back. And by the time I was 13, it was just decided by both sets of parents and grandparents that I was going to stay and live out my junior days, living with my nan in her home as opposed to with my parents in theirs.
Right. Well, you still went to the same schools and everything.
I went to the same schools, but was no longer entitled to go to the preschool activities or the post-school activities. I'd gone from a week boarder to a day boarder, and therefore it was very strictly 9 till 5 type stuff.
Oh, so you were a day student then? You didn't sleep over at the school or anything like that?
No, and so I went back to being almost the same as everybody else I'd grown up with. My friends on the football pitch and the likes. I started to become a little bit more normal and less wrapped in cotton wool.
So when you were younger, it was like boarding school. You were during the week, you were living at the school and.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. It's not as common in the United States. I mean, there's people that do it. There are people that have their kids go away, but I mean, they go away. It's like college. They go away for the semester and then they come back.
Yeah. I went away from 5 to 10.
Got it.
Okay. And you used to come home at weekends. And in my case, I'd invariably find myself running back to my nan's as opposed to my parents. So, like I say, by the time I was 13, it was just decided that that's where I was going to finish growing up.
Okay, so you stayed there until you went to university?
Yeah, I was very conscious of the fact that I ate a lot, and my nan had a part-time job, and I was very conscious of the fact that I wasn't paying my way, but obviously costing quite a lot to be brought up and looked after.
Right.
So I worked absolutely as hard as I possibly could to learn and learn and learn, not necessarily to get a scholarship, but in order to be able to get good grades, to be able to get a part-time job and to start seeing my way towards independence just as soon as possible. So I got a part-time job when I was 14.
Okay.
Trying to support my nan and bringing me up and the likes, by trying to be as independent as possible. But interestingly enough, I also found that our school from 15 and 16 had quite a modern approach to schooling, in as much as they set the agenda as to what classes you needed to attend and a timetable as to when they were being taught. But it was down to you to ensure that you arrived at the right place at the right time in order to be able to meet those criteria.
Right.
But I found that they offered extended hours. So if I could do 12 hours learning on a Monday and 12 hours learning on a Tuesday, I only had to be there till 1:30 on a Wednesday, and I'd done my week's education.
Oh, you could
So
do it that way?
from 14 and 15, it was a new approach to schooling.
Got it. Okay.
And it allowed me to get a part-time job on Thursday and Friday, and start to earn a proper sensible income even before I'd left school. And I guess that was my first introductions to, one, money of my own, and two, the world of business, as opposed to just being in a classroom learning the theory about it.
Oh, that's interesting. So it was almost like you could set up your own individual education plan because you were able to work at a faster pace maybe than the other kids, because not everybody can do 12 hours of schooling in a day. It's a lot. But then you could take advantage of other things by, that's interesting.
Yeah, the rule of thumb was the moment you missed one or didn't meet your criteria for the week, and that privilege got taken away from you for the rest of the trimester.
Makes sense, right? As long as you can manage it yourself, they stay out of your way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right, sure.
So you did what you could to be able to make sure that you met the criteria. But it also gave me a fascinating insight as a foot in both camps from both education and learning very early on in life. And because I was young and working, yes, I got tucked under people's wing a little bit, but to the same extent, I got exposed to so many things that I don't think I would have otherwise have been exposed to if I was 17, 18 and joining them from college.
Right.
But it wasn't taking pity on me, but it was more to do with, oh, let's show you this and let's show you that. You might want to do this when you leave school. And I got so many more opportunities presented to me because I was young and trying,
Right.
that perhaps wouldn't have been if I'd been a few years older and trying.
And you guys finished high school about the same time, right? 17, 18, something like that? Yeah.
Certainly, yeah.
Okay.
I got enough grades to be able to go to higher education and to study. And I chose to go and study psychology. I wanted to understand a lot more about human behavior. I needed to understand as to what prompted me to do what I'd done and other people not to do what I'd done.
Okay.
I was fascinated by how people respond to each other and behavior. So I managed to determine as to what qualifications I needed. I found the right course.
Right.
I managed to blag the interview a little bit to be able to get on the course, and spent 2 years doing psychology, human psychology, with a specialist interest in communication and human behavior.
But your focus was business, right? You wanted to figure out like what,
Yeah, with view to potentially taking on employment, working in a inner city area, working with kids from disadvantaged backgrounds to be able to help them understand that just because you've grown into this environment doesn't mean to say that you can't be exposed to other things and see other opportunities, just as I'd had available to me. But what I found very quickly was that whilst in theory, the qualification and the experience and the job lent itself to being able to achieve that, the practice was, as a junior member of the team, your job was to write reports, whilst everybody else went out there and did what they did.
Right.
And there's a good chance that for the next 6 or 7 years as a junior in the team, I was going to be responsible for making good coffee for everybody else and writing reports.
Paying your dues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't think of anything less inspiring to try and keep me going.
Right.
And ironically, I was almost saved, really. At that point, the army had just come back from the Falklands War in 84, 85.
Right.
We'd lost a few soldiers along the way. We'd had quite a significant discharge rate of soldiers coming back and saying, this is not for me, it's not what I thought it was. And there was a big recruitment campaigns to join the army. And interestingly, rather than the usual recruitment campaign where they were simply looking for foot soldiers, on this occasion, they decided they were looking for a different type of recruit, and therefore went to universities and colleges and said, look, we're looking for graduates to be able to come on to an accelerated promotion scheme who's got good grades and will be interested in a different change in life.
Okay.
Like I say, I've become disillusioned with what I was doing.
Right.
This sounded rather exciting.
Yeah, well, definitely.
So I put my name forward. And interestingly enough, I still remember, even though it was 25, 30 years ago now, I still remember the Sergeant Major saying, we don't need any psychologists. We already know we're mad.
That's funny.
which I thought was quite comical, but at least open and upfront with it.
Well, you
He
didn't
said,
fit the typical profile, right? I mean,
absolutely, yeah.
yeah,
I wasn't going to be a foot soldier. I wasn't a tank commander. I wasn't
right.
super fit.
Yeah.
I'd just got this psychology degree and an interest to understand people. Um, and the Sergeant Major looked at my degree and realised I got some decent qualifications. And he saw my CV and my curriculum vitae to be able to see that I'd worked as a young boy and I'd shown some interest and enthusiasm for such things. And he said, I'll tell you what we'll do, son. Why don't you transfer and do a year in medicine? Because we're always looking for medics. And your qualifications are sufficient. You could do a bridging course as opposed to having to do the whole thing. I said, well, yeah, I'd definitely do that. That sounds really interesting. And thankfully, the Army agreed on those proviso that they would fund a year's bridging course back at universities to qualify as a medic, on the proviso that I did a minimum of 5 years service to pay off
Right. That's
that
usually
education.
right. That's what we have here too. Reserve officers
Sure.
training. You go, they pay for all of your schooling. Then you have 4 to 6 years or something to serve,
Yeah.
depending on what your specialty is. Okay. So they sent you back. They sent you for another year of school,
Yeah.
learn some medicine. Didn't make you a doctor, obviously, right?
No, certainly. So I'm qualified paramedic. So I'm
Okay.
advanced trauma medicine for
Right.
pre
Triage in the
Yes,
field type
absolutely. I
of
mean,
stuff.
in America, I think you have what's called the PHTLS, the pre-hospital trauma life support.
Okay.
I qualified in pre-hospital trauma life support with the intent of being able to be the field medic to be able to provide safety and some protection on the battlefield and look after people until they got to the doctor or the nurse or a more safer, more confined space in a bigger facility.
Right. So you had to go to war, right? I mean, were you in areas of combat where you, not necessarily in the front lines, but where people were getting shot and then they come back and you had to put them back together and ship them off to the hospital, or wasn't that crazy?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It was
Okay.
yeah, my claim to fame is that from the moment I finished qualifying and joining the regiment to the day that I left the service, that there has never been a British Armed Forces soldier serve anywhere in the world in a conflict zone without me having served at his side.
Really?
So Northern Ireland before the peace treaty, the
Yeah.
first Gulf War,
Yeah.
3 tours of Bosnia, 2 tours of Kosovo, a humanitarian aid relief in East Timor and Sierra Leone, and then back out to the Gulf for the second Gulf War, or as we like to call it, Gulf War, the sequel. And then sadly was injured out there before we went into Afghan.
Oh, you got injured, even though you're not really in the front lines, but you're close
I,
enough, right?
I was very much frontliner. So in the Gulf, I worked with the parachute regiment to be able to provide frontline medical support as they went in to invade Baghdad.
Wow. So you've really been in the thick of things first. So how many years did you serve then? You served a long time.
12 and a half years.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So
Yeah.
then you would have continued serving if you hadn't gotten injured?
Absolutely. When I joined the army, I was convinced that I was going to do my 5 years for Queen and country. I was
Right.
going to pay off my debt. And by that time, I would have been a little older, a little wiser, and maybe ready to step back into this being a psychologist with views to continuing or picking up a career that I'd started but wasn't quite ready for yet.
Right.
And yet, probably about 7 or 8 months into basic training in the army, and I just suddenly realised that this was the missing link. This is everything that I'd looked for. It was a work hard, play lots harder mentality where no 2 days, no 2 hours were the same. There was the most incredible bunch of guys that I got to work with. And ironically, as a psychologist, the Sergeant Major was right. Most of us are all mad. Which meant as a psychologist, I was continually learning and watching and understanding and asking. It was a fascinating study group.
So it really was like a psychological study in human behavior and people under stress, really, right?
Massively. And it's probably where I first started to understand and learn all about change and change management, looking at what people used to be, and then what we call group talk or group mentality, where in actual fact, not any one person would have ever volunteered to do the things that we did. And yet collectively as a group, it gave us such confidence to be able to step outside of our own comfort zone and do something collectively as a team. And we saw this in Bosnia and in Kosovo and in the Gulf. People that individually, quite openly as to a medic, were comfortable in admitting that apprehension about some of the things that we were about to do.
Right.
And yet, in actual fact, on the field were the leaders that were drawing people and driving people forward, that collectively, this spirit of together we can get through this, just changed the whole charismatics of the person and their persona. And I was fascinated by this, that it led me to go back to the classroom, although night school and open university now, and learn all about change and change management.
So that's what you did. So when you were discharged from the military, you went back to do more schooling in.
I was fortunate enough that there's an exceptional education program available to soldiers, especially ones on an accelerated promotion scheme. So I did my change management qualifications 4 years before I left the military as an add-on qualification, because they saw the benefit of me understanding more about how people face fear and fight through it.
Right. So they paid for that, and it was while you were in the military. So when you were discharged, you were all done with all that stuff.
I'd already done that stuff, and I was able to say I got 3 years experience of applying it.
Right.
Which sometimes is the biggest hurdle for people struggling to be able to get into work, is they say, well, you've got the qualification but no experience.
No experience.
And I was fortunate enough to be able to have both.
Okay, so what year was that when you were discharged? It was
well,
90.
There's a very brief story there.
Okay.
I went to the first Gulf as a medic to go and support people, and then I had my accident. And there's something quite macabre about laying on the floor and knowing full well that you're quite seriously injured, that you can't move, that you're fighting to be able to put the morphine into your body just so you can stay conscious. And then out of the corner of your eye, you almost get this glimpse of freedom as two medics come running towards you. And not only do you think, wow, thank God they're here, but in actual fact, when they get a little closer and you think, wow, they're guys I've trained, they're my team.
Right.
And they're running in going, no way, it's the Sergeant Major, quick, quick, quick. And the last thing that went through my head before I passed out because of the pain and the morphine and everything else, the last thing that I thought of was, were they top students? That's
what you thought of? That's funny. I hope they were good at what they do.
Well, thankfully, I'm here to tell the tale, so I guess they did okay. But I was flown out of theatre. I was stabilised back in Germany, which is where the regiment had been based, and then brought back to the UK to begin my rehabilitation. And I knew full well, because I was a medic, because I'd got a good understanding of, one, the injuries I'd suffered, and two, the likelihood of recovery, that I knew that it was going to take every single ounce of effort, both mental and physical, to be able to prove to the army that I was still physically capable enough to stay in the military, as opposed to being disabilited off and to leave the military. And I was so determined that I'd loved everything about what I was doing, that I was adamant that I was going to break myself to prove that I was going to make a full recovery.
So what was your injuries?
I broke my lower back, my hip, and my left leg.
Nice. Well, that's serious.
Yeah, so I've the lower part of my back has been fused together. I've got a titanium pin that runs from my hip to my knee, and then I've got some pins in my lower leg and my foot.
Wow, that's a big pin.
Yeah.
Your hip to your knees, their whole thigh.
Yeah, I had what's called a spiral fracture of your femur. Okay. So it's spiraled all the way down from hips to knees. So you have to put a pin all the way through it to hold it all together.
Wow.
But the alternative is prosthetics and a removal. So I'm pleased that I've still got my own skin and bone.
What a story. Well, I know I'm American. I'm not British, but thank you for your service either way, because I'm sure you fought beside and were beside American soldiers as well.
I've served very closely alongside the Americans. I'm most grateful for their service also.
Yeah. Okay, so let's now you're discharged, right? And after you stopped whatever you're doing for the military, you didn't go back. You wanted to go back, but you couldn't.
Yeah, the big difference was that
you can't be in theater. That's for sure.
Well, I was desperate to prove that, because there's two levels of service in the British military. Certainly, that there's a physically capable soldier and somebody that's still able to deploy.
Right.
And they get what's called we call it what's called ex-pay, and they get a little bit on top of their normal salary for being capable and able to go out and deploy.
Right.
But then there's a lesser degree of soldier who doesn't get X pay,
Right.
that's on an admin fee.
Yeah, support, all the behind the scenes and stuff like
and
that, right?
you can't join into that role, but in actual fact, if you've still got the competencies to be able to deliver maybe a training wing post, so as long as you're physically capable of getting up and getting down and doing the stuff, they don't have to make too many adjustments to things. That it might be that you're no longer a field soldier, but you could still be an admin. So, and
right,
I was adamant I was going to be an admin soldier. I was going to see out my career teaching other people what I'd learned
in the military. That was it.
In the military.
Okay.
And 4 months into my rehabilitation, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, which is common, right? I mean,
very much so. But it's game over. You know, it's, you know full well that from the moment people have written those 4 letters on your sheets that no one's going to give you anything other than the best that you're going to get is a good transition into whatever it is that you're going to do next. But you're of no real value to the service any longer. You're now a risk.
Right.
And therefore it's best to pass you on to somebody else.
Right. So even if you feel that you can do it, I can do it. Once you're diagnosed that way.
To be honest with you, at
Jay,
the time,
we don't care what you think. So
at the time, I was quite delusional as to what I thought I was going to be capable of doing compared to where mentally I was. I went through a lot of survivor's guilt. I went through a lot of reliving the trauma I've been through on that day. And it got bad. You know, I was sectioned under the Mental Health Act for my own protection. I was on suicide watch for about 6 months.
Really? Wow.
It caused a lot of problems. I mean, and it's the first time I've ever learned, even though I was a medic, it's the first time that I had a real correlation between mental health and physical capability. Right. Because even though I was having physios to learn how to do all of the things that I needed to do again, even the physiotherapist was adamant that the surgeon had missed something or trapped something because of how poorly I was responding to physiotherapy. And the simple fact is that if this isn't thinking right, your body isn't reacting right.
Of course.
And it took them a long time. I often say I was diagnosed with PTSD before it became popular.
It was very early on, right?
20 years ago, people didn't necessarily understand what it was or how to treat it the way that we now do. And I'm firmly a believer that everyone that treated me at that time had the greatest intent of what's to try and help me do, but in actual fact was so adamant that this is the treatment program that we're going to try with you. Sure. And because it didn't happen and have an immediate result in the next 5 or 6 days, a month later, well, we won't do that. Well, we'll try something else, or we'll try something else.
Right.
And over a period of 6 or 7 months, I think I must have gone through about 7 or 8 different treatment protocols with trying to find the one that would work. Right, and I guess any one of them might have worked if we'd just given it long enough to embed.
Yeah, it's crazy because any kind of mental illness, I think 20 years ago, 30 years ago, even if you had ADHD or, anything like that, 20 or 30 years ago, they were like, well, he's not trying hard enough. Yes. Pay attention, sit up, stop jerking, being a jerk and being, jerking around in school and playing games and stuff. But it was really because you didn't have the ability to focus like other people. And I think, we've come a long way, obviously, with mental health. And
I still remember a teacher when I was 5 or 6 telling me off for writing with my left hand.
Yeah, you were left-handed and they didn't want you to write with your left hand. Yeah, they did that in the States too. They would try and switch you. Yeah. They just made it worse.
Absolutely.
It's like trying to tell people they got to walk backwards for the rest of their life. They're like, what? I can't do that.
It might have been easier for me to try and learn to walk backwards.
Right, exactly. Well, I think that, if you look at it, once you know what mental health is and mental illness and how much the brain controls everything goes on your body, it makes sense, right? So you go to war and you got bombs going off and bullets zipping by your head and people that you care about dying and you're getting your leg blown off. It would make sense that you're messed up in the head and don't even know it, just because, look, anybody, even kids that experience trauma when they're young end up really messed up in most cases as adults. Not always the case, but, so the fact that people coming back from war, which may be the most traumatic thing you can experience in your life, somebody tells you, go kill somebody else. Oh, by the way, he's going to try and kill you too. It's not surprising that soldiers on a regular basis develop these problems when we in regular life develop problems and we don't experience that kind of trauma. So,
and yet,
that's
ironically,
once you get on the other side of the fence and you look back and you go, yeah, that made sense. But nobody believed it when we were on the other side.
It's ironic because if you actually look at the definition of shock and stress, it actually makes perfect sense. And I can't understand as to why we then overcomplicate it. Right. But the definition, the medical definition of the word shock is
Okay.
the body's natural reaction to an unnatural event.
Right. Sure. That makes sense. Right.
The definition of post-traumatic stress, in its simplest form, is the body's unnatural reaction to an unnatural event.
Right. Makes sense. And it's happening. You don't even realize it.
Absolutely. Because it's unnatural. We're not expecting it so, and therefore we don't know how to react to it.
Well, if you look, when I was in, I don't think I was in law school. I was undergraduate, but I was going to law school, and I took a course in the law school, and they had, no, that's not what it was. Oh, I was taking an abnormal psych course, abnormal psychology, and I had to do a research paper on something. So I was going to law school. So what I did was I chose psychiatric disorders and the law, specifically multiple personality and its use in
Wow.
Testimony, like witness testimony. So there were people, right, that experienced so much trauma in their life that they developed these different personalities, multiple personalities, right? So, and the personalities would commit crimes unbeknownst to you. So one of your personalities could commit murder, for example, and you don't even know it.
Yeah.
And then, so is this personality able to testify? And it was, so I did a whole bit. I did very well because the professor knew nothing about the topic. So he didn't have a lot of things to say about it. He thought it was great. But I was fascinated by how much your mind can affect. There were personalities that had like you wear glasses, I wear reading glasses. There were personalities you developed that had 20/20 vision.
No.
That could play instruments that you had no training on. Yeah. Like the guy plays the piano and he'd never had piano training before in his life.
Madness.
It was fascinating. So the fact that your mind is so powerful that it could change the shape of the lens in your eye and make you see properly it's almost unfathomable that that's even possible.
Sure.
So that just shows you how powerful and how little we use our brains and how much.
Hey, I'll tell you something. The amount of time I rely on these glasses, if I can find that personality and welcome it in, I'm all for it.
Yeah, I know. And I don't wear glasses all the time. I just wear them for reading and for I couldn't see the screen if I took them off. But my kids come up to me, Dad, look at this. I go, okay, I got to find my glasses. I don't wear contacts. I just wear them for reading, and it is annoying.
Sure.
So maybe someday what's that surgery that they do for you? LASIK surgery where they
laser surgery, yeah.
laser your eyes and then you can see again. Okay, so let's bring it a little bit further. And as you got into all the kind of, I'm not sure what you do. If you do coaching now, or you do reporting and analysis.
Mentorship, yeah.
Okay, you do a lot of mentorship and coaching.
Yeah.
All right, but we had talked though. Oh, go ahead.
So I left the military, and whilst I've got these qualifications and this experience, I found it exceptionally difficult to find work, purely on the basis that I don't believe in lying. And so when people said, well, on your curriculum vitae, it says that you left the military in 2000, right, and you're now applying for a job, and it's the end of 2002.
What'd you do in those 2 years?
Where have you been?
Right, exactly.
What happened in the gap?
Right.
And when you say, well, I was injured in the Gulf, and I've spent some time in physiotherapy, but also I was diagnosed with PTSD, and I've spent some time under sections to be able to fix some of the problems I've had in living with that. But the good news is, I'm here and I've been discharged, and I'm now looking to be of use and into the labour market, and I'm looking to offer my services to. All of a sudden, you go from being a really good catch on your application form,
right,
to being a long-term sickness absence risk. You spent 2 years in hospital.
Sure, right. It can happen again, people think.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You can relapse.
There were 4 interviews where the interview was stopped as soon as I mentioned the word PTSD, and they asked me to leave the premises because they said they had a duty of care to protect their staff.
I would think that there's something discriminatory about that, but maybe
well, I'm not allowed to list the 4 companies that said that because I did take legal action against all 4 of them.
Okay.
Which thankfully paid the rent for a few months whilst I tried to find a job of somebody that more sympathetic to who I was and what I was about. And then I managed to orchestrate the chance to be able to get a chance interview with the CEO of one of the UK's largest supermarket chains.
Okay. What's the name of that? What's that chain?
Morrison's Supermarket.
Okay.
It's a family-owned chain, but they've got 812, 815 stores across the UK.
Still around today?
Oh, very much so. Yeah.
Okay.
probably 1.5 billion a year turnover.
Okay.
And it took me 7 weeks to be able to orchestrate being in the right place at the right time with the right people, to be in front of Sir Ken Morrison himself, to be able to infer that I might be of interest and value to his business, sufficient to be able to say, well, why don't you come along and pitch yourself and see what you've got to offer.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
And yet, interestingly, what had damned me from not getting a job for the last 7 or 8 months of applying was the one that got me the job with Sir Ken. Because when they said, well, where have you been for 2 years? And I said, well, I'm a psyche case. I've been mad
Right.
and
You were
locked up in a
saying it
box of
differently
frogs.
at that point, right?
Well, I still presented the same thing.
Right.
But Ken heard something different. They said, so why do you think that's of interest or values to us? And I said, well, look, everyone has a breaking point. Everyone.
Yep.
The good news is I now know mine, and I know what causes it, and I know how to prevent it from happening.
It's probably higher than most people too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so Ken is sat there at the interview. Like, I mean, this was a senior hire. This was the chance to become his business development director. This wasn't a job on the floor. This was
right.
to sit at the board.
We're going to be bagging in at checkout. This was
this is very much a strategic job of change management. And so Ken said, do you know what? He said, of all of the decisions I've ever made to be able to grow this business from scratch to what it is now, right. 890 million pound a year, he said, I've never once thought what would happen if I didn't know what to do, or if I had a breakdown or something happened. Maybe I ought to have someone on my teams to recognize and tell me as to what I ought to do. You're hired.
He didn't have any strategic plans in place, or what happens if I
he
get
probably
run over
did.
by a
I think
bus?
he was being very complimentary to me. But I just loved the fact, and don't get me wrong, I still owe everything I've achieved since then to the vision of that man, because he just looked at everything completely differently to the way that most of the people I'd ever met. He had a business plan that was 13 years ahead of where he was right now. He was such an incredible visionary, and thankfully such a supporter of military and vets, that he said, if you've been to war, son, this will be a cinch.
There's an author in this country, I don't know if you heard of him, Malcolm Gladwell. He's written.
Oh, very much so. I read a lot of his work.
Okay, so did you ever read Outliers?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a very good study about, right, why people achieve success or in what, and somewhere along the way, always the case that there's somebody that you come in contact with that sees something in you and intervenes. And maybe the timing was right. You dealt with enough objections to probably say things a little bit differently than you'd said before and still been honest. Yeah. In your own mind, what you felt. Because look, you could have gone to them and say, well, what have you been doing for the last 2 years? Well, I've been in physical and mental recovery, and I've gone through recovery, and now I'm recovered. You didn't have, they wouldn't ask you, do you have PTSD? I don't think they're allowed to ask you those kind of questions. Sure. But you didn't feel comfortable with that. So, everything kind of comes together at some point where you meet the right person and you're ready to hear it and you're ready to say the right things, and he's open-minded and, as a visionary, obviously that's one of the reasons why he's successful as he is. It's not, I don't think most of that is by happenstance.
No,
most of those guys are not accidental entrepreneurs. I don't think they might accidentally get started at some point, but they're smart enough to overcome all the obstacles of being in business.
And it's ironic because, you've just mentioned Malcolm Gladwell, phenomenal writer.
Right.
But how many times have you heard somebody that said, do you know what, I've just heard this and I'm going to act on it? And you think, hang on a minute, I've been telling you that for months. Why? Right, and it was a case of, maybe the person has to hear it so many different times from so many different people, from so many different avenues before they're ready to actually understand what's being said. And they'll only ever recall the last time it's been said, as opposed to all those times before and that have led them to that decision.
Oh, yeah, are you kidding me? How many times my sister or my children or come to me and say, hey, do you know what? I just heard this. I read this. I go, don't you remember the conversation we had 6 months ago when I told you about X, Y, Z? You should go talk to Jay. No, you didn't tell me that. I met him through this person. No, I told you, you don't listen to me.
Yeah.
But you're right.
Absolutely.
People have to be open to hearing things, like their ears have to be open and their mind at the same time. But we're all guilty of that. You got things on your mind, you don't hear anything, and then you get the same, thing. So how long did you stay with Morrison's?
So it was a fixed term position. The business development director, Charlotte, had just asked to be able to take a year's maternity leave. And I was going to fill in for her role for for 15 months, a little
Okay.
bit of a handover, and then a 12-month period, and then a handover back again.
Okay.
And although when she came back, it was offered to be a job share, it was very evident that while she was a lovely woman, I wish her well, that it was her train set, and I've been looking after it for a while. It was time for me to be able to determine what else to do. And I chose to jump in with both feet. I used some of the income that I'd earned from Ken. Ken was very generous with his salary for what we did for him. And I chose to use some of that income. And I knew that unless I did something very sensible with it, I was going to do something very stupid with it.
Nothing
so
in
I
between.
opted. Yeah, no, there was never going to be something mundane. It was
Right.
either going to be, I was either going to buy, as I did, I chose to buy a small micro business
Okay.
that was up for sale,
Uh-huh.
or I was going to buy a sports car and probably kill myself.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, you don't seem like the kind of person who's just like wandering through life very calmly. You know, you're
no,
an accountant and you go do your work and come home and don't do anything. Yeah,
no,
that's
no.
very funny.
I was all for risk or reward. So
Right.
I opted to. I bought this business was for sale. It
Okay.
had got 3 employees and the owner. And the only reason it was for sale is the owner had sadly just been recently diagnosed with stage 4 terminal cancer.
It's often, it's an illness usually unexpectedly when people,
Yeah.
because people don't love to, if their business is a good business, they don't want to just sell it,
No. No.
So, okay. So what did this company do?
So I bought a health and safety consultancy.
Okay.
I had very, very, very little knowledge other than that of the average Joe in health and safety. Okay, I perhaps knew a little bit more because of my medical training in the military,
Right.
but I wouldn't necessarily say I was a qualified health and safety consultant.
This is like workplace safety type of stuff?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So
Okay.
going into businesses and doing audits and then giving them either guidance or training on how to comply with rules and regulations.
Like OSHA in the United States.
Yes.
You guys have similar rules.
Yes.
So you had to learn all that stuff.
No, not at all.
No?
I've got 3 employees,
Right.
and my argument was, okay, so you've been trading for 10 years so far. You've clearly know what you're doing. All I need to do is to bring more clients to you and then employ more people like you to be able to do the work. And straight away, I realized that if I get involved in understanding a lot more about health and safety, then the chances are I'm going to get suckered into doing a lot of health and safety that's preventing me from growing the business.
Yeah, right. There's a difference between being the business owner and being an employee, and you happen to own a business at the same time.
It's the old E-Myth principle, isn't it?
Correct.
Of Michael Gerber.
Yes.
So it was very much a case of, and interestingly enough, the owner was willing to sell me the business for about 70% of its net value. On the proviso that I agreed to, under what's called 2P regulations in the UK, to take on the employees and to honour the contract that they were already on. He didn't want to see any redundancies or changing conditions as a result of him having to leave.
Yeah, he didn't want his employees to lose their jobs. He didn't want contracts to get canceled, and customers stay on board and so forth.
And I made an agreement with him that I would give all of his employees a 24-month contract. I would honour their existing contract for 24 months. And they had to prove themselves within that 24-month period in order for that to be renewed and to be revised.
Right.
And he was happy with that. They were happy with that. And I just decided, do you know what? I'm just going to go all out and see what we can do. 1, using some military experience of how to work under stress and duress.
Right.
And 2, all of the visionary I'd taken from Sir Ken and say, well, what could we do with this business? And over 4 years, I took it from 3 staff to 22 staff.
Oh, okay. So you grew that, and you're not in that business anymore.
No, ironically, I sold it in the end of 2011 back to the 3 employees that I inherited with the business.
The first 3 employees.
Yeah, they subsequently become an ops director, a finance director, and a managing director, and I sold it as a going concern to them. I sold it with 22 staff. Well, I sold it with 22 staff in 2012, and at the moment they've got 36 staff.
Oh, good. Okay, so
we know that the business model we implemented is continuing to work.
Right. Okay. So then, where'd you go from there?
I did a little bit of change management work as a subcontractor, as a freelancer, working for other people.
Right.
And I subsequently realised that just going back to working with somebody else was such an emotional drain, because you're then fielding somebody else's fires for somebody else's reward. You might get paid well, but there was no, other than a financial exchange, there was nothing really of interest, because you were just there to do the change management bit and then leave again.
You mean as a consultant?
Yes, very much so. You were just being dropped in to shield the flames, as it were, putting the thing right, and then not really getting the chance to be able to see the benefits of that before you move on to the next one, because they didn't want to pay an ongoing fee for you to be in the business. And I just said, look, I'll set up this True North thing. And there's a whole concept of where that comes from, but I'll set this up and see if we can provide this as a consultancy, as a service,
right,
to other business owners looking to grow. And we've been doing it now. We celebrated our 6th birthday last month. And on average, we grow by 27% net per annum.
Continually?
For 6 years.
So really, once you sold the company and you started to some consultancy work, then that kind of developed the idea of My True North, and you formed that company out of that.
Yes, because I realised that I set this business up on the 13th of May, and by the 31st of May, I'd got my first employee. And by the 17th of June, I got my second employee. And on the 28th of August, I got my third employee. And I realized that I wasn't there to do the do. I was there to be able to help people understand the benefit of doing the do and then employing people to do the do.
Right. So you're really just running the business, developing opportunities and stuff. So how are you developing most of your opportunities?
Networking.
Okay.
We have a very lucrative and a very ethical and open referral program. So I would say, well, certainly I know this because we measure everything in the business. 54% of our new inquiries come from referrals from existing clients.
Yeah, that's what fascinates me. You measure everything, and you know exactly
what gets measured gets managed. What gets managed gets measured.
Right. Yeah, because most people, they'll tell you, well, 50% of my business comes from, they don't really know that that's true or not. They have no way of knowing. I don't even know. I've never really broken down exactly where my business comes from. I have a rough understanding of it, but
I now know that 63% of our ongoing calls are now conversion into either a single piece of business, and 27% of those go on to become a long-term piece of business. And we monitor those every 4 weeks.
Okay, so let's get into some of the interesting stuff you're doing, because you had mentioned before we got on the microphone last time we spoke that you had done a study of why businesses fail.
Yeah.
And I think that is I think that is, I was in the wrong ear there. I think that is a very telling, what you discovered by doing it. So first of all, why did you end up doing that study?
So I've told you the wonderful short story of how we went from 3 staff to 22 staff in 4.5 years. I didn't mention in there that during that period, we ended up making 7 people redundant.
This is the safety company.
That's the safety company.
Okay.
So not only did we grow from 3 to 22 in 4.5 years, we grew from 3 to 17, had to make 7 redundant back to 10, and then subsequently grew to 22, all in 4.5 years.
Okay. Meaning there were 7 people that were extra. You didn't need them. You didn't need to operate. They were doing the same job as other people.
We grew too quickly and ended up having to let them go.
Okay. So you shrunk down and then you grew back up.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that I signed a contract to take our regional business to be a national business and to provide safety support to one of the largest high street retailers in the UK at the time.
Okay.
We signed a contract which was worth $250,000 a year. It was 4 times bigger than our second largest contract in the business.
Right.
And in order to honor that contract, I had to employ 7 new people just to honor that contract.
Okay.
It was so exciting for us that I failed to do sufficient due diligence on the company we were going to work with. It was a household name. Everyone knew who they were. Well, you've probably heard of it in the States. We'd signed a contract to be suppliers to Woolworths.
Sure.
And we were going to be part of their safety management team for Woolworths PLC UK.
Right.
And one, I didn't do sufficient due diligence. I'd allowed the fact that they had such a well-known high street brand name to determine that we were honoured to do business with them, as opposed to say, well, why are they choosing to work with somebody like us as opposed to one of the other big boys?
Right.
Why have they subsequently changed the way in which they operate?
Right.
And I didn't look into that. And secondly, we agreed to adhere to their terms and conditions, even though we were the supplier. Now, our terms and conditions said we will invoice you at the point of you booking and confirming the job, and you will pay us within 7 days of us completing the job.
Okay.
Their terms and conditions was we will send a agreement and a purchase order number when we make the booking or the order, and we will pay you 90 days after the order has been completed.
Yeah.
And that left me a £95,000 salary black hole before we were going to get paid. And I ended up having to borrow a lot of money. I ended up having to reinvest a lot of my own money. I ended up having to take out a huge big overdraft, put some money on a credit card just to be able to match the first 90 days until we got the first salary paid.
Yeah, people don't
realize. And then we're going to continue to be able to grow and everything's going to be fine.
Right.
And they went into receivership 57 days later.
Yeah, I remember. Right, they went out.
And like I say, I mean, I didn't have enough money. I'd remortgaged my house. I'd put every single penny I had back into the business to be able to bridge this gap.
Right.
And then 2/3 of the way through the gap, all of a sudden, the end disappeared off the end of a cliff, and with it, every promise.
So it never became. They never paid. You never got paid. Never made any money on that contract.
We were on page 17 of the receivership list, and there were 20 companies per page on the list.
Wow.
And ironically, the receiver always earns their money first.
Right, always. Yeah.
So any profits left in the business were absorbed by receivership fees. Some of the main suppliers on the front page were over $3 or $4 million.
Yeah, a lot, I'm sure. Yeah.
There was no money left, and it just desecrated. If I hadn't done what I'd done and made these people redundant as quickly as I did, the whole business would have just evolved and just evaporated as part of a collateral damage of their going under.
I see. So you got rid of those people because the contract evaporated.
I simply couldn't afford to pay the salaries.
Right, of course not. Right.
And that was difficult. You know, when you've been able to convince 7 people to leave wherever it was that they were working previously, to come and work with you in your business because of the promise of what we'd just won.
Right.
And then 2 months later, 2.5 months later, you're telling them, look, I'm really sorry, but this has gone south, and I can't afford you anymore. I'm going to have to let you go. And they can't even go back to the company that they've left,
right,
because of the speed in which they've chosen to move and join you.
Right.
It was probably more painful, emotionally, certainly a lot more painful than my injury in the military.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a lot of people that hold on to their business for that reason, and they go through their personal assets and they mortgage their homes just to keep their business going. And at the end of the day, everyone gets screwed. All the employees are out of work. They lose everything. And it's, it's unfortunate. Fortunately, as a business owner, you got to make those difficult decisions.
Absolutely.
For benefit of the company, which benefits the people that are there, and ultimately you, your family. I mean, that's just the way it is. It's not.
You've got to understand that you come first, because if you don't, nobody can come second.
It's like if you're in an airplane and the masks drop down, you're supposed to put your mask on first, because then you can't help people if you're passed out. So but look, if you're a caring person and you care about the people that you employ, sometimes there's a little smoke screen there in terms of making the right
I was a medic in the army. I'm always there to care for others. And it was very, 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 I mean, to the extent that one of the people who made redundant took it upon himself to threaten my family.
Yeah. Really.
I mean, he tried to run my son over on the way to school.
Hey.
He said, "You've taken my life away. I'm going to take yours."
Yeah.
And we ended up having to have the police, and we ended up having to move my son's school, and it was really ugly for a couple of years.
Sure.
But once I'd sold the business, 2 or 3 years later, I sold it in the end of 2011. And once I'd sold it, I'd got some cash in my pocket, and I'd paid off the mortgage, and I was now determining as to what do I want to do next.
Right.
I was in no rush to be able to suddenly jump into something else. I got that fortunate position of a nest egg that allowed me to say, well, do you know what? I need to give some considerations to what I'm going to do next.
Okay.
And one of the things that I was really inspired by was, well, I'm going to look into why Woolworths failed. Because I've done a lot of soul searching as to why we nearly failed.
Right.
But I'd be fascinated to learn as to how a business that was doing £3 million a year then failed.
Yeah.
So in the UK, you can submit what's called a subject access data request to the receivership and receive this. You have to pay a fee, but you receive the same amount of data that they received for you to look through because it was a public listed company.
I see. Okay. As long as it's
So
a publicly listed company.
yes, yeah. So I paid this fee. I received this data with views to looking at how could Woolworths fail, and that was my intent. What I subsequently found was the moment the data arrived, I was still, even a year after I'd sold the business, I was still too emotionally attached to the impact it had had on me to look at this with any real credence.
Okay.
But rather than throw it away and get frustrated with it, I just paid a fee and I wasn't prepared to waste that fee. So what I decided to do was to submit another subject access data request for another PLC company that had gone under in the same year and make comparisons.
Okay.
And then I wasn't looking at the data as if it was impacting me. I was looking at the data to say, well, they've gone under. Is there something that they both missed?
Right.
And as soon as I started to do that, there was a number of failures in the business that seems to become so prevalent so quickly, so obvious to me that I'm thinking, well, why the hell didn't anyone know about this? Why wasn't anyone doing anything about it? So you start to dig a little further and you go back to them and you ask for a copy of the minutes of the board meetings, because under a PLC company, you can have access to those also.
Right, of course.
And then you realize that some of the senior managers were discussing this openly. And it was almost a case of the elephant in the room was well known to them. And yet no one was willing to be able to address it because the fear it might have on them and their reputation in the business, or them flagging up something that's clearly been going on for a while now. I just won't rock the boat.
Right.
And it became a bit of a fad. And over 4 years, I ended up employing 9 data analysts to continually submit data access requests to big businesses or to receivers of big businesses. And over 4 years, we got a little bit carried away, and we've ended up researching 153 national business failures.
Okay.
And what's fascinating is that we found 3 flaws, 3 fundamental flaws, not the stuff that caused the failure,
right?
But if you peel the layers of the onion back to the core, if you'd had this in place, that would never have happened.
Right. The foundation issues.
The foundation issues on which the businesses either weren't built strongly, or the business had diverted in such a diversity from where they'd set out from, and yet they hadn't recalibrated the foundations to support the difference in business. They pivoted, which is what we're all going through now because of the lockdown procedures and such. They'd diversified or they pivoted the business, but they hadn't gone back to the foundations to say, and does what we now do, is it still supported by the core of who we are and what we do?
Yeah. So what was the purpose of doing this study? I mean, I know you were interested in it, but what was the ultimate business purpose? What were we going to do with it?
Initially, I didn't. I just became fascinated. I'd got this pot of cash. I knew that I knew it was of interest to me, and I went back to being a psychologist. I just went back into the learning because I was fascinated to find out as to how big the problem was.
Right.
And it 9 became 12, became 20, became 50, and before you know it, we were at 150. Right. And it was a case of, look, we're getting a bit carried away here. I've now invested well over 100,000 in being able to do all of this.
Right.
Perhaps we need to be able to find a means of utilizing
monetizing it. Yeah.
And monetizing it.
Yeah.
And I really hadn't got any clue as to what I was going to do, other than the fact that I now know with some certainty as to what causes a growing business to fail.
Okay.
So with that, I went back to my old university and said, look, I've got this data. I've been doing this research. Would it be of any interest to you? And initially they were very skeptical and, well, we get lots of submissions. And then I said, well, we've got 1.68 million bits of data that we've collected over a 4-year. How much?
Right, exactly. They thought you were going to tell them, well, we studied 10 businesses and we've come to this conclusion.
We've studied the local corner shop.
Right, exactly.
And then when you talk to them, you've got, I think we had 486 databases of Excel spreadsheet data.
Right.
And here you are. What could you do with it?
Right.
And what we decided to do collectively was, that's a study of big business. My next interest, predominantly triggered by their insinuations, is, so what level of business do we have to get to before these become fundamental and a problem to us? And therefore, why don't we address them at the time that they first become
right.
about?
So the question is, if you're a small business, you're a startup, are these fundamentals important or not?
Yes.
And yeah, and you're probably going to tell me they are, but yeah.
So what we did is we went to one of the UK's largest small business associations, the Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah, sure.
And we approached the chamber. We collectively we approached the chamber. I think they accepted the invitation because of the university, as opposed to little old me.
Right. No, you were now part of yeah, I understand.
We now represent a brand,
right,
that's known to them. So we went to the chamber and we said, look, we've done this study on big business. We'd be fascinated to do this study on small business. Could we incentivize your members to answer these 3 questions? And we'd narrowed all of our research down into to 3 simple questions.
Right.
They were fascinated to learn just what their members would respond to it, and so they were kind enough to not only not charge us to do the research, but in actual fact to incentivize their membership slightly in order that we got a good response.
Oh, okay.
They said, I mean, normally membership is paid annually, and they said, if you were to complete this study, we'll give you 3 months free extension of your membership.
Great. Okay.
So it automatically became very valuable to them to fill these 3 questions in.
Right.
And we got just shy of 117,000 responses.
117,000?
Yes.
That's more than 153.
Yes.
Okay.
116,900 and something people responded to the survey.
Right.
And we found that the flaws are already present in 86% of micros and startups.
Just like the big companies.
Yes.
Okay.
So the next question, the final question that we did in the study was, why? Why do we build a business on the sand?
Right.
Why do we not address this from before we even start the business so it isn't a problem? And the simple fact is, because so few people are taught how to grow a successful, profitable business.
Right.
Most people start in business because they've either been made redundant and sick to death of working for somebody else, or they've always had these aspirations to do so, but they might have had a little bit of college education on the theory of running a business.
Right.
But in actual fact, so few people have been to Harvard Law School or Harvard Business Schools to learn the fundamentals of business.
Yeah.
And yet even big businesses that start with a grant and some funding and some government backing and support usually come with a lot of guidance and mentors and conditions that prevent them from falling into the traps that otherwise, as you or I as a business owner, we just naturally fall into because we know no different.
Right. It's the accidental entrepreneur.
Absolutely.
There's no barriers to starting a business. There's a lot of barriers to succeeding, but there's really no barriers. If you got a little bit of money, you get a bank loan, you got an idea, then nobody's going to say, well, you can't start this business till you go to a university and you get a degree and you spend a year, in mentoring, and it doesn't work that way. So people just either they fall in, like you said, they get downsized, they get let go, and they're like, they have an idea and they just know this can be a business, and it's crazy. So okay, so you gotta stop holding back on me. So what are the 3 things that was the consistent 3 things that they weren't doing on all levels?
Okay. Flaw number 1.
Okay.
46% of the businesses that we studied in large business,
right,
and 58% of small businesses in micro businesses didn't have a business plan.
See, that's what I say all the time. I talk to people, you don't need a business plan. Yes, you do. Thank you, Jay. Absolutely do. Okay, good.
And whilst we've had good conversations,
reinforces what I'm trying to do here.
Whilst we've had good conversations, I never knew that you told everyone that. But
yeah, I tell everybody that. It's crazy.
46% of businesses, big business, and 58% of small business didn't. And when I say didn't have a business plan, that's unfair to say it on its own.
Right.
The 46% of businesses that I say didn't have a business plan, yes, I'm sure that they had some form of plan.
Yeah, they had some things written down and the way they run some things. It wasn't a cohesive plan, though.
It wasn't documented and known to everybody.
Right.
It wasn't up to date.
Right, which meaning you have to use that plan. You don't make a business plan, then go off and leave it in the
Shelve it
closet.
somewhere.
Right,
Yeah.
you have to use it.
People have this perception that a business plan is only required if you need funding, and it's ridiculous.
Right.
A business plan is your map that gets you from where you are to where you want to be.
Right.
Would you ever
And it
get
changes.
in a car?
It's going to have to change because you
Absolutely.
better adjust.
Would you ever get in a car and drive from one city to another without using a sat nav or a map?
Right.
You wouldn't just point north and say, "Follow me, chaps."
Right,
It's just
exactly.
ridiculous.
That's
and yet the amount
stupid.
of business owners that are driving blind because they are so busy doing the doing that they don't know where they're going.
Right. No, that's driving blind. I love that. That's exactly. And I'm the attorney who, let's say I didn't work with you at the beginning. Now you're coming to me and I got to pick up all the pieces of all the problems you've created for yourself. Now your house is over leveraged. You have you leased equipment. You have a lease of a space for 5 years, and I got to negotiate you out of all these things because you didn't create a business plan.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's the first thing, right?
That's the first thing. The second thing, and this is probably most prevalent right now across the world because of the circumstances that we're in, and I call it the people, system, process dichotomy.
Okay.
If we were to draw a triangle, let's do it that way. There we go.
Okay.
If we were to draw a triangle pointing downwards,
okay,
businesses that fail, or at least really struggle in difficult times, when the business is under some form of distress,
right,
either internally created or externally created, but businesses that are going through a hard time,
right,
probably like right now.
Yeah, because it's cash flow usually is
absolutely.
the problem. Right.
The businesses that fail and do the worst are the ones that put systems and processes above people.
Interesting. Okay.
Meanwhile, businesses that do particularly well in hard times and thrive are the ones that invert the triangle and point it uppermost and put people first and make systems and processes flexible enough to support the people's requirements.
Makes sense. Yeah. Because you, by the way, you send all your people home, you don't have a business anymore. It doesn't run itself. Nothing's
Until you have
automated.
an employee, you are one.
Right. You're right. Yeah. Just because you own the company doesn't mean you're an entrepreneur.
Amen.
Right.
And there's a huge difference between the fashion of being an entrepreneur and being a business owner or a job holder.
Right. Just because you're a business owner does not make you an entrepreneur. I try to tell people that an entrepreneur is somebody that grows their business, that scales value, that, runs from the outside in, but you better be careful because you might also be an employee. You don't realize it. So
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
Okay. So that's good because that shows that if you build the pyramid correctly, and you put in the systems to support the people, you can't have the people supporting the processes, and you do it backwards. And then as soon as there's a cash flow problem, the whole thing falls apart.
Well, again, this comes back to the military and going back to my time in the Gulf and Bosnia and Kosovo and that type of stuff, and why is it that the Americans and the Brits have got such a close alignment with each other? And it's because we both understand that whilst they've got rules and regulations that the White House and number 10 Downing Street bark at us every day, it comes down to a little bit of ingenuity on the battlefield itself to say, how do we make that happen? Right. As opposed to so institutionalized to say, we've just got to do as we're told.
Right.
It's the difference between communism and the free world.
Right. Free thinking.
Free thinking.
Right.
Ironically, if you were to look at any cost in a business, the greatest asset in any business is its payroll.
Right. It's also the biggest cost.
But it's only a cost if you don't sweat it as an asset.
Right. You're right. Good point.
So,
your people are the most valuable asset, right?
Your people, the greatest, I think it was Bill Gates that once said that people in a business are the greatest asset. And if you don't recruit well, retain well, and reward well, you deserve everything that you get.
Right. Yeah, because they become your biggest liability. So you have to support your people. They have to be in the right position. They need the tools to do their job, but also be creative enough to make the business better than it is.
Absolutely. Now, interestingly, if we take the military analogy and put it back into our business scenario, the people that do particularly well, certainly in a downturn, are the ones that recognize that whilst I've got these systems and processes and they were working particularly well last week, it wasn't a distressed business last week,
Right.
and we haven't written systems and processes and then tested them in distressful circumstances.
Right.
So systems and all of these business owners that command to their employees, just follow the system, don't understand that the system was never stress tested for the stress it's now under.
Right.
But by doing so, you've got disenfranchised staff that switch off and work to rule, and before you know it, the whole business implodes.
Right. Because they lose faith in their leader.
Absolutely. Meanwhile, businesses that do particularly well in a distressed situation are the ones where the manager says, look, how do we get through this?
Right.
How do we pull together? What do we need to do? What do we need to ignore or change or put on the shelf for a while because it's not working right now?
How do we support our people?
How do we support our people? And ironically, they pull together.
Yeah, the ones that are successful over here that I saw do major changes immediately are people that I've always known that were good at that. I mean, they started making things that they couldn't, because they couldn't sell what they were selling. So now they're making things for the front line. They moved their people. They separated their shifts so people weren't together so much, let people work from home. But a lot of them, what are they going to do? So then they send cars out to pick up their work. They're doing work at home. You know, they were seamstresses, a lot of them, and things like that. And they pivoted, and they're they're thriving. They're not just getting through. They're thriving. And then, you know, there's other people that has been the case. So, okay. So what was the third thing?
So the third thing is almost the polar opposite. Businesses that are doing particularly well, growing phenomenally fast, and yet still fail.
Okay.
And ironically, 17% of the businesses that we studied in the big business group, and when I say big business, these were doing at least
public
8
companies. Yeah.
At least 8, sometimes 9 or 10 figures a year.
Okay.
Big businesses.
Right.
Some of these businesses were doing incredibly well, growing and growing, industry leaders, and then failed. And the simple fact is, what we've done is, it's the third is always the most complex. We've divided the business into 8 segments.
Okay.
It's probably because, the business is called True North. It's based on a compass. So there's 8 points of a compass. So we've segmented the business into 8 parts. But businesses that failed are the ones that didn't understand the impact that their department had on the other departments in the business. So sales is so busy growing sales that they don't understand the impact it has on finance. And finance is so busy trying to cope that they don't understand the stress that they're putting on customer service and delivery.
Right.
And marketing is busy thrashing about but doesn't understand the impact it has on people.
They're not communicating, working together, meeting, knowing
they're
what
almost
each other
competing
does.
with each other, and they've created 8 micro businesses that subsequently create silos of 8 micro businesses that aren't a full business.
Right.
And as a result, they grow broke.
Yeah, no, that's more intuitive. I could see that happening because I deal with a lot of consultants, and they tell me that's a common problem when they go into a business where, operations has no idea what sales does. Sales has no idea what accounting does. Accounting has no idea what HR does. They're doing things that are contrary to other things. And if they start communicating and understand the decisions they make and how it affects other departments, they fix a lot of things.
Yep.
All right. So it's like 11:10 here. I got another call I got to jump on in about 20 minutes, but I could go on with you for a long time. But Jay, I appreciate all the things that you've shared. Let me